Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. The Athlon II X2 250, a CPU with all the twos, was originally released back in June 2009 at the price of $87 US, which is around $124 US today, or just under £100 in the UK. This particular 250 we're having a look at today though, was a slightly newer revision released a year afterwards, so I'm not sure how much that actually would have cost. But anyway, there was nothing particularly special about the X2 250. It was just another standard socket AM2 Plus / AM3 CPU running at 3 GHz. It was based on the 45nm fabrication process, featuring 410 million transistors. Being based on the Rigor architecture, this was essentially a cut-down version of the same architecture that era's Phenom 2 CPUs used. The 250 didn't have the L3 cache that the Phenom had. It didn't have any, for that matter. But it does have 256 kilobytes of L1 cache per core, and 2 megabytes of L2 cache shared between both cores. But we're going to be seeing how it does today, 14 years on from its initial release. I'm also going to be including some overclock tests as well. I won't be showing any footage of that. I'll put that in a video which I'm going to put up on the Extras channel. So if you want to see some gameplay footage from the overclock tests, then you can go check that out as well. But the clocks I did manage to achieve on the 250 are up on the screen now, so you can pause the video if you'd like to get a better look at them. But for now, let's fire into the first game. Kicking off with CSGO, I originally released back in 2012, and I decided to go with 900p for the resolution with the lowest settings. I thought this would be a good middle ground between 720 and 1080p, which I think is a bit unrealistic compared to what someone who has this CPU would actually be playing at. That aside, the Athlon really didn't do too well here. I would ignore the CPU usage number in the overlay, as that's definitely not accurate. The Athlon is most certainly being maxed out here. And I would ignore the temperature as well. AMD measure temperature differently, so that's not accurate either. Performance-wise though, it's actually mostly okay on the lighter maps, with the heavier maps presenting far more problems. Those lighter maps tend to be in the mid-30s to around 40 FPS range, but can see hard dips into the 20s and high teens at times in combat, with the stuttering being pretty bad when that happens on maps like Anubis. The overclock made a really big difference though actually. The stuttering, while still there, was greatly reduced, especially on the maps where it was at its worst, like Anubis. It wasn't exactly problem-free though. The percentile figures of 16.9 FPS for the 1% low and 7.1 for the 0.1% still weren't great, but it was a lot more enjoyable for me. Releasing just a few years later was Fallout 4, which remains just as popular today as it was back then. I've used the same resolution and settings as I did for CSGO, and I've also disabled depth of field as well. And the Athlon struggled here, but it was at least playable. I found it could stutter really badly upon entering built-up areas like Sanctuary and Concord, but that was just momentary. For the most part, you would actually still have quite a good time, despite the noticeable micro-stuttering throughout. We averaged 41.6 FPS, but I think capping it to 30 would probably help out with the worst of the stuttering and hitches. The overclock made no real difference here. Average frame rates did go up a little bit to 49.3, but the percentile figures were quite similar, so the stuttering was no better than before. And while that was at least playable, GTA 5 was a completely different story with the same settings again, except with FXAA enabled and shadows turned off through the INI file. There's an enormous amount of stuttering, and the trouble didn't end there either, because as you've probably noticed already, large sections of the roads throughout the city and parts further out don't render in properly, or at all, including several of the buildings as well. Now I'm pretty familiar with the map at this point, but it had even me crashing into buildings I didn't even know were there. The game did manage to average nearly 40 FPS, but that's completely irrelevant when the game is in this kind of state. The overclock actually even made things worse overall. The average frame rate went up a little bit, but the percentile figures were just as bad. The stuttering on its own saw a substantial improvement, and it was basically non-existent in some places, but the hitches were more severe and happened more often throughout the game. The pop-in with the roads and buildings was even worse as well. GT 5 really needs at least 4 cores, or 2 really good hyper-threaded ones, so I'm not that surprised things didn't actually improve. Minecraft is one of those games that people often imagine will run on anything, possibly even an actual potato. So with the fast settings at 900p and minimal particles, I was expecting far better than this. Not problem-free, but better. The problem started right from the beginning. Although we did manage to average 105.6 FPS, the stuttering was absolutely awful until the world had rendered in fully, and overall was still pretty bad throughout. You could improve this a lot by reducing the render and simulation block distances as low as they can possibly go, but you would end up barely being able to see anything in front of you. I'd used 5 for both, as I felt that gave us a good enough view distance in front of us without overburdening the CPU. I am wondering though if capping the FPS to 60 or even 30 here would sort out the absolute worst of the stutter. The difference made by the overclock was shocking to say the least. The 1% and 0.1% lows saw a relatively good improvement, but still weren't great. But that average, the average FPS more than doubled. It was such a substantial improvement that I couldn't believe I was using the same settings in the same world, but I was, so the difference was real. And because it actually starts, it's The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt with the next gen patch installed. And the performance wasn't exactly the best. Not that you need me to tell you that, given what you can see on the screen just now. But yeah, the performance was pretty bad. Frame rates were never more than around 10 FPS at best, single digit figures at worst, and the 1% and 0.1% lows were barely above 0, which is pretty bad unless you absolutely love your slideshows. It was bad enough to the point that the game would often completely lock up, sometimes for up to a second or even multiple seconds at a time. To be honest though, I wasn't actually expecting this to even run, so the fact it did is amazing in itself. But yeah, you are still going to be facing problems even with older games, so you're probably ideally want to stick to games round about the time the 250 actually came out, and even then probably don't go for the more AAA-ish titles. Capping the frame rate, as I suggested a few times, will actually help significantly in cutting down the absolute worst of the stutter. So you are still going to be able to run some relatively modern games compared to the 250 and get at least playable performance. Not perfect, but playable. But that's been a look at the Athlon II X2 250, all the twos. So if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe to the channel, especially if you'd like to see more content like this. I'll put all my links down in the description below as well. But that's going to be all for now, so thanks again for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.